Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Creepy Crawly Conversations. I'm Jack Elphinstone, and I'm here with my good friend and co-Insect Week organizer, Leanna Fernandez. And today we are also joined by the fantastic Dr. Juliano Morimoto, who researches nutrition and its linked to various biological processes at the University of Aberdeen. Welcome, Juliano, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for having me and for this beautiful introduction.
No, thank you again, Juliano. So today we'll be chatting about larval body plans and the human applications of these larvae as a food source. So just to begin, insects often display quite complex life cycles. Juliana, would you be able to provide a quick summary of a generalized insect life cycle, please?
Sure. When we speak about a generalized life cycle, it's a kind of a tricky question in the sense that insects are very diverse. So there are different ways and different life cycles. They're equally complex. So for instance, we have what we call the ametabola insects, which are insects that don't undergo metamorphosis. And then we have, so pretty much the juvenile looks like the adult and they just grow over time, right? Then we have the hemimetabolous insects, such as bugs, the true bugs, for instance, where we have the nymph can be very different than the adult, but in general, they do have the same structures. And then they grow and grow to the adult stage. And then we have the most diverse group of insects, which are what we call holometabolous insects. And those are the ones that undergo full metabolism, full metamorphosis. And then where the larval stage is completely different from the adult stage. And you have a pupal stage in between to link these two different life stages.
When you break down the life cycle of all these insects, you see just how amazing and complex they really are. But I'm curious, terms such as larvae, nymph, and grub are often used quite interchangeably. So do all these terms describe the same thing, or do they reflect different insect life stages, or perhaps insect types?
So that's a very good and a question that confuses a lot of people, including myself when I started. We do use these terms interchangeably, but they do not mean the same thing. So of course, grub, we usually refer to as the beetle larvae, right? Which has this very distinct shape. But nymph, it's limited to larvae from hemimetabolous insects. And they're different in a sense. So there's a lot of debate in the field, actually, of the relationship between the larvae of the holometabolous insects, such as beetles, caterpillars, for instance, and the nymph of true bugs, aphids, for instance. So there's this distinction, and they are very different in this respect. There are two theories relating these two, the nymph and the larvae. One theory says that the nymph is equivalent to the larvae in a one-to-one relationship. So the first nymphal stage is equivalent to the first larval stage, and so on up to the adult stage. But the theory that is more supported today is that the larval stage of, beetles, for instance, is a arrested kind of a pro-nymph, which is an earlier stage of a nymph that became a free living individual. I don't know if that makes sense and if it was clear enough, but that's they are different things, and they classify insects into different distinct groups.
Okay, yeah. So I feel like you've kind of explained this question I was going to ask there quite well. But specifically concerning larvae then, does this mean all insect larvae look the same, or they can appear quite different depending on the species? Are there different terms for the various larval body plans?
Yes. So the larvae of each species is or within groups, right? They're very different. So let's take examples of the most famous, holometabolous insects, which are butterflies, bees, beetles, and flies, basically. So they all have a larval stage, but the larval stage of all these species are very different. So you have, for instance, bees, ants, and flies. They have a very what we know as the maggot, right? Which is pretty much an amorphous blob of a living creature that pretty much feeds on decaying matter, for instance. When you go to grubs, which is the beetle larvae, they have more structures. They have very distinct legs, a very distinct head, and then you go up to butterfly larvae, and they are, caterpillars are pretty much one of the most complex larval stages that we can find in nature. It goes anything from having just a few legs and prolegs, which are the legs in the abdomen. They're not true legs, they're just appendages, all the way to having spikes and pretty much the whole spectrum. So they're not the same, even though all of them are larvae. They do have specialized structures and body plans.
Okay, thank you.
In addition to these different larval body plans, your research is primarily concerned with nutrition as well as its link to evolution. So have these different larvae evolved to utilize different nutrient sources? To
one extent, yes. So, in insects, the beauty of insects is that the larva stage adapted is a stage that is pretty much adapted to feeding, right? Feeding and growing. So to a large extent, their bodies were adapted to consume different, to exploit different nutrient sources in habitats. Of course, we cannot disregard other forces in evolution. For instance, predation. It's one strong factor that shapes the body plans and the structures as well. But I would say that nutrition is a big portion of it.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say is the coolest adaptation you've seen to this kind of like nutrition, would you say, from your research?
Nutrition. Some larvae can, well, it's not exactly an adaptation of the larvae, right? It's a side effect that we use today, is that some larvae can eat plastic because they adapted to eat the wax of, for instance, beehives. So because they adapted to eat the wax, now we know that they can eat plastic. And I find that very, very cool.
That is very, very cool. It's actually nice to hear an animal that actually could survive off plastic for once. So in one of your 2019 papers, you mentioned how diet composition can also affect the immune systems of certain insect larvae, such as caterpillars. How exactly does this occur too?
That's a great question. The mechanism of how this affect, how this comes to be true, it's still debated. We still don't have exactly the mechanism. But one thing that we know is that increasing protein for the larvae, increasing protein intake seems to benefit larvae in terms of immune system and fighting infections and fighting viral infections, both viral and bacterial infections. It could be because of the expression of, for instance, immune genes like antimicrobial peptides. And recently, actually a week ago, there was another paper published by a collaborator down in Lancaster, Kent Wilson. And they're showing that protein intake actually changes the osmolality of the hemolymph, and that precludes bacteria growth. And that helps the caterpillar fighting infection. So this is an ongoing investigation, the mechanism. What we do know is that diet plays a massive role. In terms of behavior, the caterpillars themselves can adjust their behavior, what we call a nutrition self-medication. So once they are, for instance, infected with the bacteria, they change their dietary preferences to eat more protein, because the nutrition rich in protein would benefit them, will help them fight that particular infection. So it's a wonderful field, and there's a lot to be discovered yet.
So you've already touched on protein briefly there, but are there any other nutrient types, for example, perhaps carbohydrates, that have either negative or positive effects on the immune system of insect larvae? And if so, have we identified which of these nutrients have these positive and negative effects?
So as I just mentioned, protein has a positive effect. And as far as we know, the balance between protein and carbohydrate it's what matters the most. in this respect. So for instance, they're not necessarily independent, right? So if they eat more protein, they're automatically eating less carbs. And that balance that makes a difference. So you could think of nutrition as a mesh, right, of things that are interconnected. So in a sense, protein does have a positive effect, but the reduction of carbohydrate also has a positive effect, which comes by changing the balance of nutrients. We are still uncovering these things. This is a relatively new field in a sense that we have now, for instance, molecular tools to investigate mechanisms, and that's how we're going deep into this field. But yeah, so as far as we know, the balance between carbohydrate and protein have its strong effect, and protein itself can help larvae fight infections.
No, that's amazing. And you know, it's amazing that these insects have been able to adapt so well to, well, almost adapt so well to different types of nutrition. And you're also interested in the practical applications required to rear insect larvae in order to feed livestock. So, what challenges must be overcome if we are to start using insects to feed our own livestock?
Right. So I think from the top of my head, what I can think of is three main points that we need to consider if we want to move forward with insects as food, basically. First one is obviously the individual perception, just our cultural understanding of, eating larvae. I think that's the main barrier. A lot of people are disgusted by, the thought of having a larvae in your plate or any insect in a general sense, right? So the attitude towards insects, I think, is the main barrier. But moving from the attitude, I think we need regulations. We need, a proper understanding of how we can convert and produce insects in a safe way for commercialization, not only for livestock, but also for human consumption, right? And lastly, I think the problem is scalability. So yes, even if we change the attitude and we have perfect, reasonable regulation to produce those insects, we still need to produce them in large quantities. So how do we do that in a sustainable way from the environment perspective, but also in a profitable way from the business perspective?
Well, I think that the question that perhaps livestock owners and environmentalists would like to know is, are there many advantages in using insects to feed livestock in opposed to, say, traditional feed types?
Yeah, so this question is still debated, right? Because we still don't have enough science underpinning this field. But one thing that is clear is that larvae is much more efficient in converting, food into biomass, usable biomass. So they emit a lot less carbon dioxide, for instance, or other greenhouse gases that, are contributing to climate change. So in that instance, insects are beneficial. What we don't know is if the net effect of producing insects is indeed more cost effective than other livestock or other sources of nutrients. Because we don't know, for instance, how much water we can use or we need to use to produce these insects in a large quantity. So I think the major benefit is, yes, we reduce greenhouse, we contribute to climate change efforts and sustainability, but we also need more science on the other factors that play a role into producing large quantities of insects. So we can safely say, look, this is a better alternative.
No, that's such an interesting topic, and I'd love to talk about this more at length, but I think we're running out of time. So I have one more quick question, and that's, knowing this, do you feel as though humans should also start substituting certain meats within their diets with insect protein? Do you feel as though, the cultural perception of insects within the UK itself may prevent this from occurring on a large scale? So maybe the aesthetic perspective?
Yes, that's a very good point, actually. So as I mentioned before, the attitude towards edible insects in general, not only larvae, right? It's the biggest challenge that we face today in the UK, but also in Europe in general, right? Europe also has a low acceptance for insects as food. That's not the truth for other regions. So for instance, Africa, Latin America, where I'm from, and some cultures in Southeast Asia and Asia in general, they are quite accepting of eating insects, and insects are actually considered a delicacy in many of these countries of these regions. My personal opinion and my behavior is that I have substituted meats for insect food. So I do eat insects on a regular basis, and I do avoid eating all the livestock meat. So I avoid eating red meat, and I don't eat pork at all. So I think that's the way we can move forward, of keeping our diet, balanced and healthy, while protecting, and striving for sustainability. And not to mention that human diet evolved in an entomophagy way, right? We as a species, we used to eat insects. Insects were part of our diet. It's just that with now, in the 20th and 21st century, that we decided to abandon that.
I think one more quick question, sorry. Just with that in mind, do you expect to see insects in UK supermarkets soon?
Some supermarkets do have. Sainsbury, I think, is the first chain to have insect-based products in their shelves. So I do expect that to become a trend more and more. Not only in the UK, of course, in Europe as a whole, and US, but I think this movement has already started.
Maybe we'll be seeing Sainsbury's Taste the Difference range of insects soon, I suppose. But all of that was brilliant, thanks. But sadly, that is all the time we have today. I would just like to give Juliano a huge thank you for joining us today. And if you would like to learn more about his research, then you can access his University of Aberdeen profile page via the link below. Thank you all for listening today, and happy Northeast National Insight Week. We hope to see you all again tomorrow. Goodbye for now.